What a day, huh? Lee and I have been working on this for a long time, and that it has come together so wonderfully. I'm so really very pleased, and I want to thank everyone for coming and for your great questions and your attention, and just a general thank you. Thank you. So our last session, we've conceived of this as a slightly different thing to close out our day today. I've invited a number of public historians whose work involves taking the research of historians and their own research that they do on their own behalf, and turning it into stories for broad dissemination for the public. And I thought that it would be a great way to close out our session today by having a kind of more open-ended discussion and drawing on the wisdom collectively of the folks in front of you who have been doing this for years, but also to kind of brainstorm ourselves as a group about where we go from here with the material that we've been thinking about the last 6 hours or whatever it is. And so I'd like to introduce the folks on our panel today. This panel is called, it's a roundtable discussion called Maritime Underground Railroad and Public History Going Forward. And we have four folks joining us. And I'll go from my right, your left to right. Janine de Silva is Program Manager of Visitor Experience and Resource Stewardship for the New Bedford Whaling National Historic Park and the park's cultural resource expert, focusing on architectural and local history. She's been a consultant to the New Bedford Historical Society and the Massachusetts Historical Commission. She is co-author with Catherine Grover of the article, quote, Historic Resource Study of the Boston African American National Historic Site, prepared for the National Park Service. So welcome, Janine de Silva. To Janine's left is my longtime colleague and friend Lee Blake, who, if you live in New Bedford, it is impossible not to be aware of the work that Lee does because she does so much. She is president of the New Bedford Historical Society, a grassroots organization that preserves and celebrates the legacy of African Americans, Cabo Verdeans, and Native Americans in her hometown, New Bedford. As a public historian, Lee has received several awards for her work, including the Robert G. Stanton Award from the National Park Service for promoting and preserving the history of the Underground Railroad. That was 2018. A Massachusetts Cultural Council Commonwealth Award for her work in the humanities, and the Massachusetts Humanities Governor's Award in the humanities. Both of those were 2019. And in 2022, a Bay State Legacy Award for her work in African American history. And I also want to say, and just remind us, that it was Lee's initiative coming to me these many years ago that started this ball rolling. So without her, we wouldn't be here today. So please welcome Lee Blake. Next to Lee is Shawn Quigley. I met Shawn for the first time not too long ago, but became aware of his work as I was just finishing the manuscript for the volume that we've been talking about today. And I came to find out that, lo and behold, here was a guy in the National Park Service up in Boston who was doing very similar work focused on Boston itself. So Shawn Quigley has been a park ranger for the National Park Service in Boston since 2012. He has spent most of his professional career exploring the history of Boston's free African American community in the 19th century and its role in the abolitionist movement, in the Underground Railroad and the fight for civil rights. Quigley has coordinated research and interpretation about the maritime component of the Underground Railroad in Boston for the National Park Service, and he is the creator of a public website focused on that theme. So please welcome Shawn Quigley. And last but not least, Janine de Silva, what am I saying? Akeia de Barros Gomes, I'm so sorry. Dr. Akeia de Barros Gomes is the Senior Curator of Maritime Social Histories at Mystic Seaport Museum, the Director of the Frank C. Munson Institute of American Maritime Studies, of which several of us in this room and in this museum are alumni. And she's also a visiting scholar at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Until last year, she was the Curator of Social History at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Akeia is responsible for working on curatorial projects of race, indigenous histories, ethnicity, and diversity in New England's maritime activities. So please welcome Akeia de Barros Gomes. What I think I'd like to do is, would you all like to open with just a few thoughts about your, about what you'd like to contribute to get this conversation started? And then I have some questions that I'd like to feed to the panel to get a conversation going. So maybe we'll just go right down the line and begin with Janine.
So I'm going to start by bringing my National Park Service local park into the conversation. In our park, we have a saying, if it didn't happen in New Bedford, it didn't happen. So, and we have, as I told Tim, we have lots of receipts. So I thought I would bring it up because some of the speakers we heard earlier, while they were focused on different regions, we didn't necessarily hear a lot about how that tied to New Bedford, and some of their stories do tie to New Bedford, and I wanted you to know how they tied to New Bedford. So for example, when Dr. LaRoche was talking about extant Black abolitionist homes, well, we are fortunate here. We have the home of Nathan and Polly Johnson, the first free home of Frederick Douglass, that is being preserved by the New Bedford Historical Society, one of the sponsors, and as Lee mentioned, she's the manager of the home. We also have the Reverend William Jackson home on Smith Street, and Reverend Jackson was the chaplain of the 55th Regiment and 54th Regiment. His home is still there. We also have the home of Lewis Temple, who created the Temple Toggle Iron on Bedford Street. That is actually a neighborhood that has several houses that were known to be abolitionist based. We have South 7th Street where there are homes there. So I just wanted you to know, here in New Bedford, we're proud of the fact that we have homes of extant homes, Black abolitionists that are still there, that you can still walk to, that you can still see, that are there. And hopefully when you go on the tour tomorrow, or either of the tours, you'll be able to see some of them. And let's see, what else was I going to talk about? But that's a big one right there. So, oh, the Pearl. How could I forget the Pearl? I can't forget the Pearl. So as was mentioned earlier, Daniel Drayton tried to liberate 77 enslaved people on the Pearl. They got caught. Okay. Daniel Drayton tried to liberate 77 enslaved people on the Pearl, got caught, went to jail for 4 years. Not only went to jail, lost his wife, lost his family, lost everything, including the will to live. So he came to New Bedford where he had friends, 2 abolitionists who had moved to New Bedford after the Pearl, William and Lucinda Bush. They were his, I'll say they might have been his co-conspirators in the Pearl, but he came there, met with William Bush, and they were the last people he saw before he went to the Mansion House and killed himself. So he actually lost his will to live, but the people in New Bedford took it upon themselves to put together the money, bury him in New Bedford, and raise an obelisk in his memory because they valued what he did for people on the Pearl. And then I also wanted to mention one other thing we talked about. I saw a lithograph of Henry Box Brown, and that is one of the stories we tell in the park. We had a box recreated using the dimensions that Henry Box Brown used for his box. We have it in the visitor center if you would like to see it. And he came to New Bedford after he escaped, and he stayed at the Ricketson House on Union Street, so you might see that tomorrow. The house is no longer there, but the site is there. You may see that tomorrow when you're walking over to the Nathan and Polly Johnson house. And one thing I'll say, we were talking about people writing down their stories. Well, here's a story that was written down. And he got criticized for it by Frederick Douglass. Because as Douglass said, once you write it down, then everybody will know that's a way that people can escape from slavery. So that shut that door on that kind of escape from slavery to future people who wanted to liberate themselves. So just to give you a sense of how we are in New Bedford.
One of the reasons that I wanted to have this panel at the end is so that people could see how academic conferences really help us in the really kind of the groundwork. We're the foot soldiers. We try and take a lot of this work to do things with, to create educational programs for kids, to do murals. And I'll talk a little bit about, Jan talked about some of the houses. New Bedford is really interesting because they have responded, City Hall has responded to our advocacy. The Historical Society is now 27 years old. We became a historical society really because many of us had rich stories from our families. Our families would tell us these rich stories about our ancestors, our grandparents, historical figures, and our kids were going to public schools and they didn't know anything. They didn't know anything about New Bedford. But it's not just that they didn't know anything. They didn't feel a connection to the city's history or the city's future. And if you don't teach young people what happened here, kids, I am a K through 12 teacher. I taught high school before I went into city government in New York and worked on curriculum issues. But I would teach kids, and kids would say, nobody important ever came from New Bedford. New Bedford's the armpit of the world. They were negative about where they lived. So what did that say for them? They didn't see any future. So our work, my work, Shawn's work, and Akeia's work, should really get young people to think about their future, but also they came from a proud past. So one of the things the Historical Society has done is we've worked on doing visible culture, murals. We have the 54th mural, which has never been tagged. I tell people that all the time, because kids feel power from that mural. We have a Frederick Douglass mural that talks and shows the history of the labor movement. And we did that in collaboration with UMass. We have a statue of Lewis Temple. And when I say we, the Historical Society envisioned these things, came up and fundraised to get these things done. We have Paul Cuffey Park here, and there are members here who helped for 10 years to keep Paul Cuffey on the front burner because people would laugh at us and say, well, what do you want to study him for? Well, and we know why, but we also know why they said that. So that's what we do. And working with the national park, we have wonderful ambassadors who take the history that we have researched and turn it into programs like the ladies, the 1850s ladies. And I saw so wonderfully the anti-slavery fair because my great-great-great-grandmother ran the anti-slavery fair here in New Bedford. So we have to show young people those things. And it's a connection to their history, our history, and it's a connection to their future. Thank you.
So like a lot of people who have talked before, I do want to thank Lee and Tim and, you know, our gracious hosts here for allowing us all to come together and talk. You know, my name is Shawn Quigley. As Tim said, I've been with the Park Service for 10 years. I've been very fortunate to be in Boston. I've been doing a lot of work researching the 19th century community, free African American community, and within that research, there's a lot of exploration of the Underground Railroad. And my understanding of the Underground Railroad, as a lot of people have discussed already, is that overland route. And about 3 years ago, I came across a story where someone had escaped as a stowaway on a ship, and it kind of piqued my interest, and I looked more into it and kind of did a lot of the research that resulted in the article that Tim referenced. And, you know, I think with the Park Service, one of our key roles as stewards of, you know, the spaces that have become national parks are to make sure that the stories are shared with visitors, with people who may not be able to visit us, whether that's in an online space through a virtual presentation, and to make sure that these stories, you know, get out there. And one of the things that for me is so powerful, and I'm so fortunate that I get to do, is to not only speak about these places, but to physically be there. That place-based experience is so valuable. Being able to stand outside of the Lewis Hayden home, I know he was referenced earlier, where, you know, so many people cross that front door for sanctuary, for safety. Words can't do that justice. And with the story of the Maritime Underground Railroad, looking at it through the lens of Boston, one of the ways that we at the National Parks of Boston tried to tell this story was through the creation of a walking tour actually out on one of the Boston Harbor Islands. If anyone here has ever been to George's Island, Fort Warren, which is a Civil War fort, you can walk along the top and get a beautiful vantage point of, you know, all of the islands in the harbor. And to be able to share stories, you know, for example, I'll just share one quick story where I found a newspaper article where in 1858, a man named Philip Smith had escaped as a stowaway on a ship. The headline out of the article is "Fugitive Slave Escaping in Boston Harbor Electrifies the City." And it talks about how Philip Smith was discovered on board this ship from Wilmington, North Carolina. It's December. It's cold. He's locked inside of a cabin. Abolitionists got word of this and actually tried to board the ship, but when they got there, the ship captain said, "He's gone." In the middle of the night, Philip Smith picked the lock, ripped a piece of wood off the ship and jumped overboard in December, swam over to an island and was picked up by a passing ship, brought to an anti-slavery community in Boston, and made his way north to Canada. Now that's a really powerful story, right? But when you're on George's Island, you can stand on the top of the fort, you can look out in the water where that ship was anchored, you can feel that sea breeze, you can smell that salt air, and you can look at that island and you can picture jumping overboard. And you know, when we're in a place like New Bedford, you can walk these streets, you can see all of these buildings which have been referenced. It's so powerful. And you know, I thank all of the scholars that are in this room who have done all this meticulous research in those dusty rooms, those archives, to be able to create, you know, these articles, these books that allow us as public historians to use those secondary sources to enhance the stories that we're telling. And I do just want to share one final story about the power of place, because again, fittingly in New Bedford. In 2015, I think it was, I came to New Bedford with the park and was fortunate enough actually to visit the Polly Johnson house. And none other than Lee showed me around the house. And brilliant storyteller. There was one moment, and I talked to you about this last night actually, where we're in the front parlor and there's a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's in a frame. It's old. Oh, well, thank you, yes. And you look at it and it's a you know, really powerful framed image. But you might not even notice this. It might look like it's just worn because it's old, but Lee pointed out that it was the Emancipation Proclamation that was in the home of Lewis Hayden. And if you look at the corner of the frame, there's a worn piece of it where the paint is gone. And what Lee said was that part of the Emancipation Proclamation, when you left, when the Haydens were leaving the house, every single time they would use their thumb to touch it. And they touched it so many times that it was worn away. And that's the power of those, you know, that's the power of primary sources, seeing them. That's the power of objects. But ultimately, that's the power of storytelling. So thank you.
So I think I got this. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Tim, for this amazing conference. And thank you to all of the contributors to the book who provided us with these new and exciting perspectives. I am going to veer off a bit in my thinking and how I think I'm going to use this moving forward, and potential new directions for this scholarship moving forward. Earlier today, someone mentioned how historians just stumble into things. I stumbled into maritime history. In my previous life, previous career, I was an anthropologist and archaeologist, and I was a college professor. And I was profoundly impacted by fieldwork in two places. One in the US Virgin Islands, where I worked in a Rastafarian community, and another in Ghana and Benin in West Africa, where I was studying traditional African spirituality. And little did I know, 10 years ago when I was doing that work, that I would now come to see that as essential to the work I am doing now in telling these stories. Very serendipitous, chill-inducing, if I could tell you specifics, but I don't have time to do that. And when I was teaching, I taught a course called, it was a very long course title, African Spirituality in the Literature and Culture of the Americas. And it was a chance for students to explore elements of African culture, African spirituality from all over the continent, right? Because we know that enslaved people did not just come from West Africa, they were transported from there. But all of the things that we take for granted and we think of as American, or we do, in our everyday lives, that come from African culture. And the way I used to explain it in my classes is, when I get a little bottle of milk, I shake it before I open it. I think I do that because my mother used to do it. But both of us were doing it for no reason at all, because milk is homogenized, right? It's this carryover, this thing that we still do, because even if we don't know why it's been passed down to us. And I'll bring it back to this topic, I promise. But the one thing I think that has been missing from this conversation that I'm exploring now as a scholar and a public historian is, we shouldn't start the story of African American maritime history with escaping from slavery, or with African American, thank you, Rufai, or with African Americans engaging in maritime industries, because there is a millennia-old maritime cultures on the continent of Africa. And I think the story needs to begin there, because what skill sets were passed down, what stories were passed down, and very importantly for me, and here's where I'll bring it back to what we're talking about today, what elements of spirituality were passed down, particularly regarding water and the ocean. Because, oh, I'm so glad this picture is back up. As I was looking at this image earlier, I'm sure, and Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, this is an image that is depicting an escape. Okay. But, just thinking about the double-edged nature of water, right? How it's this place of our ancestors and of freedom and of mamiwata and of spirituality. It is at the same time a place of enslavement and trauma and death, right? This very circular idea about water. So the so-called element of water itself, I think, needs to be explored through African and African American voices and lenses. Because when I look at this image, it might be an escape scene, but it might also be the scene from Igbo Landing. It might also be a baptism. It might also be an area for worship or a ring shout. So water means all of these things, and I can't help but think when we think about maritime routes of escape, you know, and it came up earlier, talking about rivers and marshes and swamps, but also how people felt about water and the power of water itself, and how we should talk about water itself when we're telling these stories. So it's not just a way for people to escape. It's a life force, but it also needs to be respected, but it's also a place of trauma and death, but it's also a place where the ancestors reside, right? And correct me if anyone knows if I'm saying this incorrectly. You know, if you think about the story of Igbo landing, there's a saying in Mende, I believe it is, that when someone passes, they say that person is crossing the waters. So if that is passed down 3, 4, 5 generations, what was in the minds of people that were using these maritime routes to escape their enslavement? And what were their beliefs about the power of water being, you know, being the thing that enabled them to do that? So that's where my mind goes, you know, as I'm listening to all of these fabulous presentations. How did people feel about water? Which makes it much simpler, but also far more complex. Thank you.
All right, that certainly gives us a lot to think about as we start. What I want to do now is I'm going to pose some questions for us to consider, and then I'm going to open the floor up to your questions, and we'll hopefully develop here a conversation that can go back and forth for the remainder of our time. But here are some questions that that are meant to sort of prime the pump a little bit. So, and these are suggested questions that Lee sort of brainstormed, and I think they were particularly well suited for this particular panel. So here we are. First question is, how are we promoting a more realistic view of local history? And it can be applied to New Bedford or pretty much any location that is connected to this broader story. The second question is, how are we incorporating the marginalized populations into a narrative of US history that has been whitewashed in time, and how can we correct that whitewashing? And the final question is, what projects or work are we currently involved in that is rewriting the narrative to be more inclusive? So maybe y'all would like to think a little bit about that if you have a response, and then we can have questions from the floor.
Tim, I actually want to respond to what Akeia was saying first about the water, and I'm just going to throw another wrench in there. I think everything you said is very enlightening, thinking about how Africans and African Americans have a relationship with the water. And then I would bring it to today and say, how did we lose that relationship? Because if you read any kind of modern stories now, they'll talk about how African Americans don't swim and don't know how to swim and have a very uncomfortable relationship with water. So I would love us to figure out, how did we lose that connection? Is it trauma from being enslaved? Is it trauma from Jim Crow? What is the trauma from? And we need to figure out how to reconnect ourselves to the water.
So I also thought of Akeia's information on water, and I do a lot of work with young people in parks, and also read the newspapers all the time, see unfortunately, all the drownings, and look at that in a historical lens. Is that Black people, that was another way of oppressing us, as not allowing us to use pools, not allowing the YWCAs and the YMCAs, did not allow us to learn how to swim. they in many ways stopped us from keeping ourselves alive with water. And that's a whole focus of many people who actually, I have a friend actually at Brown who is raising money to make sure that young people are taught how to swim, that young Black boys and girls are taught how to swim, because that is also something that was cut off from them by oppression. So that is one way that I look at it. And we all know the stories of Southerners who would rather pour acid into pools than to allow Black people to swim in it. So we know those stories, and those are stories that have really changed the way that people have looked at water. So those are things, it's like contemporary issues in water. And our people, our African ancestors, thought of walking across the water to get back to Africa, and they knew they were going to drown, but that was okay because they were going to be free on their own merits.
Now that we've made it really heavy in here. I know, right? So how to include communities not traditionally represented? I'm not sure I want to use marginalized all the time. Communities not traditionally represented in history. I mean, this is something I think about with the Park Service, and just in terms of employment and trying to figure out how to have more people of color employed by the Park Service. I'm stuck sometimes knowing how to answer that question. It's I'm stuck sometimes even knowing how to answer the question when it comes to people in higher education, because until everybody starts seeing the equal value of every voice in the room, we're always going to have a difficult time being heard. We're always going to have a difficult time getting into the room. And I think one of the things I'm trying to do since George Floyd was murdered is bring out the uncomfortableness and talk to people about, you know, my PTSD at being the only Black person in the room, and given my position and what I study and what I represent, that happens very often. And to make people understand, it's not easy for us to be in this position either. And you should know that. You should understand that. And you should value what we have to say instead of maybe trying to demean or challenge or not listen to us. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I'm just trying to get it out there so people open their minds and have a different way of looking at history, community, and life.
To be clear, the objective is not to walk away today having answered these questions. It's important to get a conversation started, and maybe, you know, from the folks who are here to participate and to observe, think about ways that you would like to see this story interpreted for a public audience, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that as well. Other comments?
So I want to talk about a project I'm currently working on that might help, you know, that might answer your question, Tim. So right now I am working on a project that is a part of a Mellon Foundation funded project, Reimagining New England Histories. And my role at Mystic Seaport is to be the lead curator on the exhibit that is the endpoint. This work never ends, right? But that is the culmination of all of the work that goes into this 3-year project. And the endpoint will be an exhibition that essentially is a representation of how the story of the development of New England would be told if it were told through Black and Indigenous voices, ancestral and descendant voices. And the title of that exhibition is Entwined, because the histories are entwined, right, for better or worse, Sea Sovereignty and Freedom. And so the way that we're going about telling this history is from a community perspective through Black and Indigenous voices, not curatorial or academic voices. But very importantly, and this is also from my anthropological bias, if we're going to do justice to telling the story in this way, we have to commit to telling it through Black and Indigenous voices, even down to, we got to get rid of the notion of linear time when we tell these stories. We can't make it all about slavery and colonization, because that still centers the European narrative. It makes it as if the most important thing that ever happened to Black and Indigenous folks was contact with Europeans. And that is the most important factor in our identities. And so really telling a narrative that comes from African, African American, and Indigenous cosmologies and concepts of time and the things that are important in those communities, and making sure that it also reflects the present, right? That those communities are here, and despite oppression, they have survived, they are persisting. There is a lot of joy in those communities. There are things that are still being passed down to children for the next generation, skill sets, knowledge about the earth and the cosmos, and all of the things that Black and Indigenous folks want told. But importantly, not telling the stories that are for those communities only, that should not be told outside of those communities. And so what we are hoping is that, we're of course hoping the exhibition and the project is successful. But as far as Mystic Seaport is concerned, we are hoping that it's a good first step in continuing this conversation, and more importantly, continuing sustained and reciprocal relationships with Black and Indigenous communities, so that when people come to see the exhibit at Mystic Seaport, they don't leave the exhibit and say, oh, that's the Black and Indigenous exhibit over there, that it's all over the landscape of Mystic Seaport, that it's seen as an essential part of the overall story we tell and not just a singular exhibit, and that we continue to do the work even when the project is over. So that's one way that we are tackling this at Mystic Seaport.
And I'd also like to weigh in on how we are tackling, but also the connections between these other communities that presented today. One of the wonderful things about the Underground Railroad is that there were connections. There were connections between communities, between families, between people. People talk about, like the 5 most important Black people. When you're a kid, you're studying Harriet Tubman, you're studying Frederick Douglass, blah, 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 blah. You never hear about Frederick Douglass's family. He had a whole bunch of cousins and aunts, and those people were sold right in front of him. And he saw that, and that is one of the things that motivated him to leave. So you have to talk about the connections between people. We are so lucky to be able to talk with Cassandra and talk about the people from Virginia, from Norfolk, that came to New Bedford. And they set up families here. And those families went back and picked up people and brought them here. So the Underground Railroad is a wonderful way of talking about how families work, how politics work, how Black people became really allies to other people, but also that whole position of sanctuary, but also that people pull together in their little communities. So people say, well, New Bedford, do you know how many people at the time, so I'm gonna say 1840, 1845, that people like Frederick Douglass lived here, but people would say, well, how many fugitives lived here? People believed, and the number they gave was 400 to 700 people who had been enslaved that lived in New Bedford. The Black population was 1,200 at the time. So it's our job to collect those stories. And we have been collecting those stories, but it's also our job to connect them to where they came from. So whether they came from Georgia, or whether they came and went to Canada. We want to tell those stories. And that's an important part of the Underground Railroad, but it's also an important part of how valuable people thought that families were, that they would try and keep their families together. And it was a difficult time, as all of us know, because white folks didn't feel bad about selling your family. And when they sold your family, you would try to find out where they were when you became free. So I want to say there are a couple of wonderful books where people who had been formerly enslaved talk about trying to find their family members. And people think, and you know, I'm also a social scientist, so we would hear those kind of arguments in the 70s and the 80s. Well, you know, Black people really didn't care about their families. No, no, no. Our families were stolen from us. They were stolen. And people really did work hard to find them again. And that's part of what we have to say and talk about when we're talking about our research. We kind of mentioned 5 important people. In New Bedford, we've been able to really uncover a whole series of wonderful stories about people, about houses. We've made sure that those things continue to exist. We've saved those houses. And of course, part of this conference and the exhibit is about saving those histories. And you'll see some of the pictures of people who were advocates here, who worked hard to make sure that freedom was available for a lot of people. So just that whole idea of families, researching communities, researching the connections between communities, hooking up with the Underground Railroad. And we're hopeful, the Historical Society is very hopeful, that at this point in time, right now, there's tons of money for tourism. So why can't we have a Massachusetts Underground Railroad trail? Why can't we fund that? Why can't all of our communities hook up and make sure you get your pot of money, I get my pot of money? But we're telling the story of families, communities, connections, and the maritime trades, and the state's paying for it, right?
All right, why don't we have some questions or comments and insights from the audience? I'd love to have that begin here and then over here, and then over here. Yeah.
So in talking about connections, at least in a lot of these major cities that are undergoing gentrification, they create transient communities. And these communities then, you know, lead to the disconnect in community. And then the communities that once were, you know, everyone sort of compiled of different backgrounds are now broken down into socioeconomic silos, which don't necessarily communicate with each other. Just in noticing that, what is a sort of remedy to sort of, I mean, it's already in progress, right? The gentrification, it's not going to stop. So how do you bring these communities back together? How do you break down these barriers and get people to communicate with one another again?
I'm hoping you'll respond to that.
Oh no, we're gonna let you do it.
I'm not sure I know how to respond to it. I think, well, that's some of the stuff we've been talking about at the National Park Service, like trying to figure out how to make the Park Service relevant to all communities. And there's been, in the last 3 or 4 years, we've all undergone different trainings, trying to figure out how to tell different stories, how to reach out to different communities. Our demographic visitor is not, it's not inclusive. It's people in their 50s who are white, who are college educated. And I want to break through that. I'm trying to still figure that out myself. And I think seeing the number of people here is helpful to me because I can invite you to come to the visitor center in New Bedford. Most national parks are free. So if you can get there, you can get in. We also we do school visits. We're trying to do more virtual education programs. And so if you come visit us, we'll be happy to talk to you. And if you want to try to figure out how to do a program, we're happy to help you do that. So that's one way I see breaking it down. I just kind of feel like I was not a person who grew up in the National Park Service. It's my last job. I started working at the National Park Service in my 40s. But since I've been working at the National Park Service, I say to myself, why shouldn't people of underrepresented communities be a part of it? We should be a part of it. They're telling our stories. We pay taxes. We deserve to be here too. But I don't want to invite you. I want you to feel empowered to be able to go to a national park site and see what's there and listen to the stories and learn about the communities.
I'd add also that a big part of the equation is education and starting young. I'd like to see people generally advocate with their members of Congress and their local politicians to raise the amount of money that's available to schools, to take them to historic sites, to engage them with history. I try to do outreach in this area, going to public schools to give talks about the work that I do, and I'm just one example, but this kind of thing is what gets children engaged in this kind of thinking early on, and I think that helps to break down these barriers. We don't do enough of it. We don't do enough of that here in the United States, and so I think we need to do a better job of that generally. So there's a question here, and then we'll come over here. Okay.
Hi. Can you hear me? Okay. So throughout this whole entire day, I've been sitting here listening to all of this amazing history and all the information. And I keep wondering, and I came here thinking that maritime, New Bedford, and one time I've heard about someone saying about the free Black people that were here that other people heard about and came here. But I have not heard anything about the other free Black people that have lived in New Bedford since mid-1800s. And I'm wondering why. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists, other than the people from here, from New Bedford, are aware of the other free Black people who were here in New Bedford that other people saw fit to come here because they were able to get jobs and go to school with white kids. And that's the Cape Verdean community. So where does the Cape Verdean community fit into all of this historical, particularly maritime, given the fact that we know how to swim. We come from water. I mean, it's in our blood. Is this community being represented or not, in what did we participate in this Maritime Underground Railroad? Did we assist? Did we hinder? Were we part of the white people helping because we were part of the Portuguese history, and therefore we were not part of the Black history, and we're the ones who tell them where to find the slaves that came here or not? I'm missing something here about the history of the Cape Verdeans in New Bedford, the free Black people who people are referring to. What did we do? What did we participate in? I see Barros, I see Gomes, I see Silva. I'm a Raymond, I'm a Barros. I mean, there's plenty of that. Any of these names, do they come up? Do they do anything? Did we do anything to be part of this history? And does anybody know, what our participation was? Please tell me.
That's why I share two cultures. I share the Cape Verdean culture and I share the African American culture. That's how I am by those two together.
Jasmine, could you give Carl the mic so he can be heard? Thank you.
I'm not getting clear what you're asking.
What I'm asking is the people who from the underground, the maritime underground, were there any Cape, and I'm asking for my information's sake, were there any Cape Verdeans that were on a boat that helped free a slave from the South? Was there anyone who can tell me that there was any history of any Cape Verdeans that did anything in the midst of it? I know about being married to. I know about families.
Well, when I'm telling you about the churches, and they're involved in the creation of the church, those churches were involved in the Underground Railroad. So I would say those Cape Verdeans, those early Cape Verdeans that came here, that belonged to those churches because they didn't feel comfortable in some of the other churches, were a part of this just by being of their church, taking a stand on this.
But do you have, I'm looking for a name or a part of history. I'm just saying that in doing the research, did someone come up with a name? I'm just simply asking a question about this. I'm not coming in, let's saying Mr. Gomes was there when so-and-so was freed or helped him get off the boat and give him food or something. I'm just asking a question, doing the research,
So
have
if
Cape
I
Verdean
could-
names come up.
If I
in
could
the systems.
interrupt, one of the things about this conference and this time period, the Underground Railroad, really goes up to, as we've seen, 1780, 1790, to just about the Civil War. And really, Cape Verdeans begin to come to New Bedford about 1840. So that's a whole period. And one of the first names that we've seen is Antone as a Cape Verdean name. But it's not until about 1835, 1840. And initially, there are just a few Cape Verdean men that come. And several of them lived on Bedford Street over by Cuffy Lawton, who was from Newport. So, we are doing some of that work. And I'd also like to mention and really kind of expound on what Jan was saying, is we'd love people to come and volunteer and help to do some of this work. My family is Wampanoag and African American, and my family, I can trace my family back to 1780, and I have done that. But that's my family, that's my work, and that's a lot of work. But we would love to have people who want to step forward and help us do some of this research. And we would be happy. Carl has been just tremendous with sharing, and that's the other thing. Share your information with people. And we certainly would love to do, and I see Lucy Bly shaking her head, one of the 1850s ladies, because she shares her information all the time. And we need to do that as communities of color, allies, to work together to do research, to make sure that everybody's voice is heard.
I would like to follow that up with the fact that the park has conducted an ethnographic study. After 14 years, we finally had it published. We had it done on indigenous community, the communities of African descent, including St. Helenians, West Indians, and African Americans, and the communities of the Portuguese diaspora. So that included Azorians and Cape Verdeans. It's on our website. we had some difficulties with it because our researcher who focused on Azorians and Cape Verdeans did not spend a lot of time researching the Cape Verdean side. So I'm not going to say it's the perfect report, but it does have some information on it. And I would follow up by saying, yes, that Cape Verdeans came to New Bedford 1830s, 40s, 50s to go whaling. But again, it was mostly men. Some of those men married into African American or Wampanoag communities. And so it's kind of hard to like separate people out. And me, I'm kind of a wash ashore. I came from New York City. My grandfather came from Brazil, but my ancestry that I know about is from Georgia and South Carolina.
I would also say that, you know, historians are dependent on written records for what we include in the story. And in the absence of names that are absolutely, and that was going to be my next point, Carl, is that there are gaps in the knowledge, and so one of the things that could be done, for example, is to systematically go through the city directories of New Bedford and find Cape Verdean names or Portuguese names who are people of color. And then we have to make an inference. Is that person of color with a Portuguese name, is that a Cape Verdean? It's not necessarily the truth. It probably is, but you know, we'd have to find out more. But the point is that to find out more about that demographic and then connect them to the Underground Railroad, we need written evidence or some kind of evidence. And there just isn't a lot of it yet, but history is something that grows over time as more people get interested in this subject, and we have people willing to do the slog in the archives to get the evidence. Then that part of the story can be added to and augmented with that kind of additional information, and we would welcome it. You know, this is. Can we wait just to get you a microphone? Thank you.
What brought me to the question was the fact that we were talking about the free Black people that were here, that encouraged slaves to come here. And I get that, I understand that. So if this free Black people that were here, who were they? And if they had to be here during this maritime Underground Railroad movement, and that was my question as to why, you know, if these individuals were here and we know who they are, or at least we identified them as who they are. So if we know they were here and they were encouraged and they acknowledged that they're there, so they had to be here when this was happening. They didn't come afterwards. That's why I was questioning whether or not anybody has, and I'm sure that I'm probably going to go looking to see if, you know, I have information to review that you can add to it, but I was just curious to find out if in the workings of this, did anybody come out with, now you said an Antone. So now I know that there's someone named Antone who participated. That's what I was asking.
I would also mention that Massachusetts, slavery ended in Massachusetts in 1784. So that meant any person of color who was in Massachusetts was free. So when we say free people of color, it doesn't necessarily mean they weren't American born. So you're going to have a variety of people in New Bedford who were born in Massachusetts or born in New York State or born in Connecticut, places where there were free Blacks. They were considered free Blacks.
Okay, I'd like to take us in a little different direction. We're talking about very modern history here, and I'd just like to remind us all that the cradle of civilization was in Africa. And sort of following up on Akeia's points, the great rivers of Africa, the Nile, the Senegal, the Niger, and the Congo, there it is, all brought civilizations to the coast, and the coastline of Africa was so immense. And there were civilizations there that were very important. And they unfortunately got the hell beat out of them by the slave traders. But Akeia talks about going back to study and to learn from that history. And there's this new book by David Francis, the professor at David Fisher at the Brandeis University, who went and looking at Akan heritage and brings that to bear and puts that into the mind of Cuff Slocum, who came in 1720 as a slave, and the influence that he had through his children, Paul Cuffey, etc. And I think that's a marvelous thing to look more deeply into African culture that came with the slave population and has had a tremendous influence on our lives ever since. And it predates all of what we've been talking about.
So I'd also like to come back to Naya's question, because there are several projects going on right now that are doing oral history of Cape Verdeans. And it is coming out of the University of Massachusetts, out of the Portuguese Studies Department, under, I can't think, Sonia Pacheco. Yes, Sonia Pacheco. And there are a number of Cape Verdean individuals from New Bedford that are working on this project. But they are capturing people's oral history, people who are working in agriculture in Wareham, around the city, and people are doing that work. And it's, it's not always reported. You're not always going to read about it in the newspaper. Sometimes it's because you're volunteering and you hear about these things. We also are very lucky in New Bedford that we now have funding for a Cape Verdean center in the north end of New Bedford, and we're hopefully funding for the south end center, and that people will be doing programs to capture information, names, oral history, and you all should be part of that. We are hopeful. The Historical Society has been doing those things, so we want people to be part of collecting the history, passing on the legacy, and certainly you can talk with us, Naya, and we'll give you the names of people who are doing that you could network with.
Great. So
just one thing that I would like to say, and I'm preaching to the choir. History is history. It's everyone's history. And people, every single one of you has a history, but they're all interconnected. It can't be separate. I don't really like to see Black history. I don't really like to see white history. I don't want to see European history. I don't want to see that taught. I'd like to see history of everyone, not white men, not Black men, not white women, not Black women, not Asian women, but all of us, because history is everyone's. Now, each of you is a receptacle of that history too. And some of the stories in history are not written. You are the receptacles of that. That's why we have programs like the oral histories. That's why we ask people to join us at the National Park, where we try to preserve history, at the Whaling Museum, in all the historical groups. We can't do it alone. The professionals can't do it alone. I taught for more than 40 years in a high school. I taught languages that were part of my heritage, but not always. I taught German. I had no connection to that at all. But I joined a family in Germany at one point and gathered a great deal from them. And I shared their stories and their histories because it's all part of history. And so I'm inviting you, please come and join us. Please tell your part. Please give your part. Don't separate it. Don't hide it. We don't have to hide it anymore. Please, let's all share it.
Thank you. Just behind.
I want to first thank you all for this day. I'm a volunteer docent and a member of the board of directors of Linden Place in Bristol, Rhode Island. And the story of our water is the DeWolf family who brought 30,000 Africans enslaved to this country. And so we have people who come to the Mansion Museum to see the Chippendale couches. And my job is that they leave with an elevated conscience. I could not do it without you. We have 2 paid employees, that's it. So everything is volunteer. And if I didn't have your knowledge, your research, your sharing of information, your encouragement, and your courage, I could not do it. We have to tell a full and robust history. And every day that history changes. And how could the DeWolf family ever be connected to the maritime underground? Well, listen to this. When Harriet Jacobs got to New York and she got stuck and she was trying to get a little bit further north, there was a lawyer in New York named John Hopper, Lawyer Hopper, who met her, brought her to the steamship going to Providence, talked to the crew, hid her on the boat, and helped her in that last journey to the north through the Maritime Underground Railroad. Why do I tell that story? Because a couple of years before that, John Hopper eloped. And who did he elope with? Rosalie DeWolf, the granddaughter of James DeWolf, the most infamous slave trader in Rhode Island. So what you do today and what you have shared with me today sends me back and helps me be brave in telling the story and telling the story of courage and resilience and triumph and all of the talents that all of those people brought to America with them from Africa and shared in our town's economy, our state economy, and the economy of the United States of America. So thank you for today.
I'm going to give our last question to Cheryl, who had her hand up a moment or a comment.
Thank you for your work. This was really a great panel. And I wanted to go back to what Akeia said about what I want to go back to what was said about water. I was conservator on the African burial ground 30 years ago. And the burial ground was next to the collect pond. And we talked about the power of water then, and I'm thinking to myself, here it is again. But water, culture, oral history, ethnography, all these things that we know will further the story powerfully are often discredited, discounted, ignored, not funded. So how then, I think this is a brilliant concept, I can see it happening, but our work also centers on elevating these things to say that they are not less than, they're not an alternative, but they have equal right to exist as these paper-based, document-centered, fact-informed narratives. And so I think that part of the work is to promote these aspects that we know are so powerful and so important, but also so disregarded, disrespected, misunderstood, and understudied.
Thank you for that. because one of the things that I want to make sure I do in this project and moving forward is when I talk about African cosmology, or when I'm sharing those stories, when I'm sharing indigenous cosmologies, to make sure that I don't present these stories as if they're myths from 1,000 years ago that no longer shape people's daily lives, right? That they are real and they are present and valid, right? To validate these stories so that they're not dismissed. I think that that's essential. That's a really important part of what I'm doing. I think what we're doing to make sure that so I always say when I use the word myth, if I'm doing a presentation, if I use the word myth, it doesn't mean the story's not true, right? It means it's a story with a moral truth, whether we believe the facts of it or not. But it doesn't, using myth shouldn't invalidate the veracity or the legitimacy of a story. And I think once we do that, and it will help people see these stories through African, indigenous, and other lenses, as opposed to trying to rationalize them or theorize them. So, I just gave a presentation where I told the story of Igbo landing. And I said, we cannot present that story if, I'm not gonna go into the story, if you haven't heard it, look it up. It's a fascinating story. It is such an important story that it was actually in a Beyonce video a few years ago. She used that story in one of her videos. And yes, and Daughters of the Dust. So it's the story that has inspired artists, musicians, and African-American communities for a long time. And the story can be told in two ways. One, that it was a mass suicide. Another, that Africans flew home. And the way that it has been presented is that Africans believed that other Africans flew home, but it was a mass suicide. That invalidates the story right there. And that invalidates the cosmology that the story originates from. And so I think that it's really important that part of this work is validating those stories. And I'll say, just to end on this, for me to end on this anyway, have any of you ever seen the movie, The Language You Cry In? It's amazing. It's about 20 years old, and it's about this woman who sings this song that she says, it's like nonsense words, but she always heard people singing it, and so she continues to sing it. And I hate to spoil it, but I will tell you, just to prove a point, that she ends up going to, I think it was Senegal, maybe, and sings the song, and the people in the village start crying because word for word, it is a song about people being ripped from that land and sold into slavery. And 150 years later, she is still singing it because it's been passed down. And that's maybe I should have used that instead of the shaking the milk analogy. That's a much better way to say, we retain these things even though we don't remember why, right? But it's so important that we've held on to them anyway. And I think that that is a whole exploration in and of itself.
Thank you for that. As we begin to wind down, and I know, Peter, you have a question or a comment you'd like to make. In putting together a conference like this, I incurred, and Lee and I incurred a lot of debts, and we have a debt of gratitude to pay to a lot of people, including the folks of the New Bedford Whaling Museum and loads of folks. But a couple people I'd like to single out. One of them is holding the mic and is going to make a question here in a second. Peter Linnell Walker and his associates, Samia Walker and Jasmine Baird, who have been behind the tech end of this production today, and they've done a spectacular job. So I want to say thank you to them. And they're the driving force behind another really fascinating thing that's happening here in New Bedford called the communal space, which is a, Peter, if you want to say a couple words about it, that'd be awesome.
Quickly. So the communal space is a diverse arts cultivator. We built a proof of concept. We've heard a lot of conversation, especially post-2020, about the conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but where does that conversation change as far as ownership? So we had a radical paradigm shifting idea to buy a building downtown, BIPOC owned and operated, a communal space. The name is in the meaning of the name is in the space, but it's for everyone. And I just want for a second, if you go to an Italian restaurant, you go for the entire experience. If you go to an Asian restaurant, an Indian restaurant, what have you, you go for the entire experience. But one thing I've noticed when people of color do business here, or especially African Americans, is a lot of the times we are fearful of making our space 100% authentically us to appease our consumer. We're not going to really be in a space where we can actually affect change until you're comfortable coming into our space with us being authentically ourselves. That's why we're building a communal space. Now, as a young person of color who's attending this, one of the young-ish people of color in the room, I want to say that I came from Boston 11 years ago. I was a troubled youth. I was in the streets. One of the catalysts of me making that massive transformation over the last 10 years to do the work that I do has been learning about stories such as Paul Cuffey, Elizabeth Carter Brooks. These are the stories that I feel like need to be highlighted more, because even the young people, we understand the struggle, but we have to see the entirety of that arc. When I learned about Paul Cuffey, it changed my perspective on life permanently. I did not know that there was a man of color in this region that did the kind of quality work that he did at the time and took the stakes that he did to do that work. And he was bold and he was audacious about that work. And so many women of color also have been bold and audacious about that work. I love this conversation, but how do we get more younger people involved? We have to tell more of those stories. A lot of our young people are stuck looking for heroes in the fiction side of it, but we need more stories in the factual, objective space of what we actually know through history, and we need to pioneer people like Paul Cuffey, Elizabeth Carter Brooks, Lewis Hayden, Nathan and Polly Johnson, all these wonderful people that have derived right here from New Bedford. I was an hour away and had no idea about any of this rich history. Just an hour away, and I'm telling you 15 minutes away, a lot of people are missing the context of that history. So how do we do that? I feel, in my personal opinion, and then this is not casting judgment on anyone in the room, but sometimes we get comfortable with a few people of color as our friends, and that's what we lean on. Make new friends, have new conversations, get younger people in these seats. Grab a kid you know that's young in your neighborhood and say, hey, come to this conference with me. Bribe them, I don't care, get them in here, okay? Because it's vitally important. And again, like I said, I wanna thank everybody a part of this panel, even being, especially Lee Blake, for bringing me on to the New Bedford Historical Society, seeing where I was in my process of my transformation, and empowering me with this information. The project of going through Abolition Row Park is absolutely astounding. Everything we're doing with the Black History Trail here, absolutely astounding. I went around and I photographed every single location. And as I did this, I got to see what we're talking about, where some of the homes are still standing, as Janine so eloquently put. And I got to see about some of the stories that Akeia is talking about earlier, where we're talking about the water. I grew up in Boston, where I was born in '85 and still didn't have access to water. The Y was not welcoming to us. You don't have to put a sign up to not make you feel welcome. And I came here, now my daughter's 4 years old and she's surfing. So it's about empowering us and engaging us to get that connection back with water. So I want to thank you for that, because that was probably one of the most meaningful things that I heard today out of this concept, is tying us into a story of water that is not solely steeped in pain. There's a lot of power and renewable energy in water. So I just want to thank you all for that. As a younger person in the room, for this context and this conversation, it was absolutely incredible. And I'll finish with this. As a younger person, as a new generation, we're not putting asterisks next to people of color. We're grouping us. We have to talk about this conversation. Sure, we want to highlight different cultures and different backgrounds, but it's a diaspora, and we need to act like it, and we need to move like, we need to operate like it, because that's the only way we actually change the paradigm, where we're not looking at people suffering from savior syndrome, and we're empowering ourselves to make the mission what we want it to be. And how we tell our stories is important, and how we do that. So all history and all context is important, but this work is painstaking. It's a living document, if you will, and it changes as you discover new things. And that discovery only happens if we talk about these stories that are steeped in our pain, and a lot of our families didn't share with us. My family hails from Newport News, Virginia. There are stories that I recently just found out, and I couldn't understand why my family went through so many years of trauma. If you think reversing 400 years of oppression is going to be a pleasant conversation, it's not. And it's that the progress is not going to be steeped in what's comfortable. So I also appreciate that overall theme here. Just wanted to share that with you.
So Peter Walker and his organization are going to be putting together the video, the editing and making available online, the talks that you've seen today. And again, I want to thank all of you who stuck it out to the end and stayed with us. This has been a wonderful day for me. The coming together of such an effort. Thank you so much. And you've all been deputized, remember, so it's on you now to go out and spread the story. Thank you very much. Lee, do you want to give us some?
So it's been a long day. I thank you all for listening. Go out and have some food because I had to order it. Go out and have an opportunity to talk to somebody, make new friends, keep the old. So thank you all.